Okay, Nate, pause this. Really? Are you fucking kidding me?
I'm not kidding.
Oh my
Kind of
God.
horrified, to be honest.
That's awful. Okay, unpause, Nate.
There is an animal that finds us in the night. I see its eyes reflected in the sky.
Welcome to the 3% Podcast. This is Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm here with Tom Roberge from Albertine and New Directions. And this, after a couple weeks where we had multiple guests and lots of things going on, is kind of a slower podcast in comparison, which is probably for the best.
Yeah, no guests today. One, because we're not in Asheville anymore, surrounded by people to have as guests. And I don't know about you. You're holed up in your office, and I've been sitting here reading Welbeck all day. So,
how's the Welbeck going?
It's really great. It's slow. I'm reading in French, so it's there's still the slowness of trying to comprehend in another language. But once you get going, after 10 or 15 minutes, you sort of fall into it and whatever. But it's really frighteningly prophetic about the future or a potential future in not just Europe and France, but even in this country, of the way certain people, certain parties might come into power and that sort of thing. It's really rather terrifying. But more on that later, I guess.
Well, yeah, except to remind that your panel is on March 4th?
March 4th.
About Welbeck at Albertine.
Yes.
Up at, is it 962 Fifth Avenue?
972 Fifth Avenue.
Oh, I was so close, though. So 972 Fifth Avenue. Probably at, what time is it?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. on March 4th, where you'll be talking about Welbeck, or moderating a discussion on Welbeck.
Yes.
Which should be actually really, really cool. When that book is coming in English, like in this fall, isn't it? Or is it?
I believe it's this fall. Lauren Stein is doing the translation and is working on it right now. So
that's really cool. So is Lauren going to be on the panel too, or is it just you and some other people?
It's me and the French novelist Catherine Cusset, and then we really want to make it all about what other just readers, people, customers from the bookstore, other people think about it. Sort of like a book club, but a more guided version of it, I suppose.
Oh, that's pretty cool. That'd be really interesting. So if you're in the area, you should go check that out for sure. I was actually up at your store on Saturday, I think. Yeah, Saturday, for the first time, which was awesome to see, although I didn't go upstairs into the store part of it.
Well, you were in the main part of the store. Upstairs, art books and children's books and things like that. So
I was in the fun part.
You were in the fun part, the literature and philosophy.
Right. Exactly. And it is really beautiful. It's such a nice space, the whole cultural services building, the whatchamacallit, that embassy.
Yes. The former Payne Whitney Mansion. So.
Right. It's gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. And I was there because I was in town this past weekend for the FNL, how do they say it? The Festival Neue Literatur, that's put together by the Austrian, Swiss, and German governments to help promote Austrian, Swiss, and German literature. And the festival, I don't know how long it's been going on, but they have different directors each year. This year it was Tuss Lewis and Brittany Hazelwood put it together. And they had a series of events. The main ones all took place on Saturday. There was a one that I was on, which is about editing translations, which we'll get back to in a second. And then there was one on money and on how money changes everything, and about money in terms of like the books that have been written, not so much as a business practice, but as like a cultural force within the works of fiction. And then there was a party, and then there was a roundtable on Sunday morning with all 6 of the authors that came, and they produced like a nice booklet with excerpts from each of the 6 works. I think only one of the authors had been published in English so far. I might be wrong about that, and maybe some of the other ones have been signed on. There's a couple that hadn't been signed on at all, and each one of the events sort of highlights them and highlights some issues related to literature and translation. Generally, they revolve around German literature, which is, I think, why you said you didn't know about it, say, because you're on the French side of things. But the panel that I was on was a conversation moderated by Sal Robinson, who put this all together, in which 4 pairs of translators and editors got on stage and talked about the process of working on a specific book. So Ross Ufberg and Michael Wise were there from New Vessel Press. Susan Bernofsky and, oh my God, the woman, she works at Grove, and she runs a magazine called Stonecutter. Do you know who I'm talking about? God damn it.
Katie?
I think that might be right.
Is she Irish?
Yes.
Okay. Katie, I can't remember her last name.
I can't either. She's sorry, apologies. And Michael Reynolds was on there with Tim Moore, and then I was on there with Lisa Boskov-Ellen, who did some of the excerpts from the anthology that we published, 1,000 Acorns in One Forest. And each one of the conversations, like Sal had some general questions that people got on stage and we talked about whatever, like how the setup of how that book came about the work that how we worked together. And then she'd have some specific questions about that particular text or that particular situation. And my one was fine. There was nothing like super dramatic, except that our book included 28 different pieces, some of which had been published before, some of which hadn't, and involved like 4 different translators, and like how that all got kind of put together was something different than the other 3 instances. But the thing that was most interesting, I think, and the one that I want to talk about with you, is that after the 4 groups went, we had like an open question period, and as it led up to that, we got into this semi-heated discussion where Michael Reynolds and mostly Michael and Ross Ufberg, about how Michael was arguing that people shouldn't, that when everyone was on stage, they would talk about how they would sometimes edit the translation, like pulling it back, specifically with Ross's book. Michael Wise was encouraging him to pull back some of the humor because it was too absurdist and going too far and too strange, or just going too far, and that it needed to be edited and like culled a bit. And Michael was arguing that is awful, essentially, and that publishers should not be editing translations in that way. And his argument was like, it was multifaceted, and I think it needs to be parsed a little bit to really give it its full due. But basically, he was arguing that when you read a book, if you're reading the book in translation, you're acquiring that book as it is. So if you don't think that book is good as it is and needs to be edited, you shouldn't be acquiring it in the first place. And that secondly, a lot of things that we're editing are things that are just part of that book as is, and that perhaps in Bulgaria, Romania, Germany, Argentina, France, that they had been put in there for a particular purpose, and that it was like disingenuous to publish a book and sort of alter that. And this sparked off a lot of people that were against that idea. And his kind of additional argument to it, before we try and like kind of hack this apart or like get into it more, was that if you think about it in the opposite way, and his examples were like, if Marilyn Robinson, Philip Roth, or I forget who his third author was, if we found out that their books are being translated into, say, Hungarian, and the Hungarian editor was like, well, this part doesn't really work for us in Hungary, so we're going to edit it, that people would be mortified by that. And that's no different than if we're changing or editing a Hungarian or German author when it comes into English, which I think you'll have a great response to because Philip Roth.
Well, I have nothing to say about that. But how do we know that these authors aren't edited when they...
That's quite true. And that's I kind of feel like they probably are. And that there's also like, he kept arguing that Europa's view is that you're completely... attached to the text as it is. Like you don't make any changes. You translate it as it is, which Susan Bernofsky was not happy with, since she claims, as a lot of people would, that there is no such thing as being like exactly replicating the text as it is. That translation is a transformation of sorts, and that isn't going to be an exact thing. That's not possible. So like that as an ideal is kind of a weird thing to use as a standard. But yeah, that was. What's that?
I actually agree with Susan on that. There is no such thing as a literal translation, or at least there shouldn't be, because stylistically it just wouldn't work as well. Part of what you're doing is, taking this work and bringing it to a new audience that hasn't seen it before. And if part of that means putting it in language that, is true to the style and the format and all of that sort of thing, but also, put in a different language that functions often in a different way, and in some cases in very different ways. And so what's more important, I think, is the author's intention. And, if the tone is one, and I'm reading Welbeck right now, and he's got what I would consider a very deadpan sense of humor, where he'll often just, he'll be going along talking about something, and, sort of he does this thing where he's very detailed about scenes and gets into, the various possible motivations for why he does something. He's very self-analytical, his characters are. And then at the very end of, a paragraph or several paragraphs, he'll just make some sort of deadpan comment that represents the entire humor of that section. And, the point is to get all that in there. And if, the turn of phrase at the end isn't humorous when translated in English, you have to make it that way. Otherwise, you would lose the humor. And that's just one example, but that is the point, is that you're putting forth Welbeck's sort of worldview, and that needs editing. It needs to be transformed from one language into another, from one audience to another. And I think what Michael is arguing is that, we are all the same audience, and, we appreciate the books in the same way, or at least we should be, and that sort of thing. And I get that. I get that, we shouldn't expect that books translated into English for an American audience adhere to our existing sort of literary history or something like that.
Right.
But it's kind of insane to think that you can just translate it and let it stand on its own and be taken the same way. I mean, you might lose a lot of the nuance and the genius of it when you do that.
Yeah, and that's pretty much how that argument went. Like I have some issues with the term author intent, because I think that's murky and goes down a dark road. But I agree basically with exactly what you're saying, and that was part of what our discussion was on stage, was that if it's something that's not fitting what we want it to be, I don't think that should be edited. But frequently these things are like, these books are in process. There is no, one of my issues with what he was saying too is that there is no singular finished book as book that is the Bible of that version, the Bible version of that book, that is the one that must be exactly translated word for word and so even putting aside all the complications of that's not really an existent thing. And that frequently, if the books have or haven't been translated, having them enter into English in a different way, or in whatever, how that gets edited or how it gets improved or changed, can be very advantageous for the author and the book and the writer as a whole, and for the audience. And that it's kind of absurd to say like, oh, we'll have to just keep things as they are, even though it doesn't work in any language, just because that's how it got published in X country.
Yes. We should be doing the author a service, right? We should be enhancing the book as much as possible when putting it into English or whatever, going vice versa the other way. We should be making it the best possible product in that format, in that language that we can. And if that means editing slightly, I think that should be done. And, who's to say that the author wouldn't want that? And perhaps they do want that.
And frequently they do. We even said, like, that was part of the conversation, was like, when you're in touch with the author and working with them on these books and working with them to change or edit or improve or whatever term you want to use. And I think he was still opposed to it, even under those circumstances. That I think his line is something to the effect of like, part of what we're doing as publishing translations is publishing the publishing aspect of that book in its original language. And that, however, that publisher did it is something that we should be preserving when we bring it over into English. There's a whole nother line that I didn't even want to get into with him, was that he kept saying like, well, if you don't read the entire book in the original, that's what you're buying in the first place. That doesn't happen as often as I think he thinks it does. Because like, how many people are reading full books in Icelandic before they're publishing them, or in Latvian or even Chinese in American publishing? Like, you're working off of other things. So you may get the full book and say like, oh, there is like something about this that I wouldn't otherwise approve of. and have to deal with that situation. But like, granted, we try and read every book in its entirety in the original, but that's not the case with all publishers and all books in translation, and sort of might point to the reason why Europa doesn't do anything aside from Italian and occasional Spanish books.
Well, I mean, that's tricky. I mean, we both work in publishing and with translations, and yes, a lot of times what we're basing, and for anyone who doesn't know this, a lot of times what you're publishing on is a sample translation of what, maybe 25, 50 pages at most.
Sure. Yeah.
A summary usually from the publisher or whoever has the rights that is trying to sell them to you from that other country, a summary of the entire plot. And perhaps you get an outside report, or, it could be something formal or it could be something informal, such as, we've New Directions has a history of this, is, we discovered Ira because Francisco Goldman said, you should publish this. And he knew the book backwards and forwards, and we trusted his opinion and saw the sample translation and made an offer. And so, you have to trust people, perhaps not necessarily the editors themselves, when acquiring a book, and then, you might get the translation and 6 months later and say, oh, hey, whoa, this is not what I bargained for. And, if you think that it would be a better book, if you're Barbara Appler and you have a translation on your desk and you think there's 30 pages that are just totally inconsequential to the plot and offer nothing in terms of background or style or commentary or anything to the plot, that it was just, the writer not being reeled in when it was published in the original country, which is also quite possible, then, it's within her rights to at least, ask about this, about trimming it, if it's possible. Or, say it's got a confusing narrative structure that, 90% of which you're going to keep, but every once in a while she thought needed some clarification, and maybe you just move 2 paragraphs around for the sake of better comprehension. Like, maybe I don't see why that's such a problem. The writing is still the same, and the overall product, the book, is still generally the same, I would think.
Yeah, I do too. I agree with you. I mean, it'd be interesting to talk with Michael more about this because he had a lot of strong opinions about it. And I can sort of see where he's coming from if you're using an extreme example, on the other hand, of that someone takes a book and instead of keeping the quirkiness of how it was written in French, tries to make it sound like Jonathan Franzen. Okay, then you've got a problem. If you're reworking it into something that it's not, but if you're clarifying the translation and helping the book become the book that it's supposed to be, that's what you do with any book, more or less. I think with translations we don't do it as much because it's not as freewheeling editorial process. But that's what happens. And frequently you're signing on books even in English that you haven't seen the whole thing of.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, a minor example, but there's often cultural things that get translated too that generally it's a good thing to do. Like, I remember editing a French novel when I worked at Penguin, and there was a name of a restaurant or a bar or something like that was Johnny Rockets or something like that, and I was like, that's actually the name of a chain of restaurants here in the U.S. I was like, I think we should change it just because it's going to read really strange, And
does it take place in a shopping mall in the Midwest?
I was like, it's just the name of a restaurant. I understand we can change it to something equally sort of, the whole point of it was that it was, not necessarily American themed restaurant in France, but that, they were sort of enamored with a certain, 60s sort of era style of restaurant or something like that. And that was it. And so I was like, we'll just change the name. And I can't even remember what we changed it to, but we'll just change the name. We'll still get the spirit of the thing, but it won't also happen to be the name of an actual chain restaurant that's terrible, And so little tiny cultural things like that, keep the spirit, but remain translated, for lack of a better term, that I think should be okay. Whereas, if you're going to keep everything exactly the same, I don't know. I think it can get problematic at times. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't think it's that. It doesn't do any good for anyone. or it doesn't necessarily do any good for anyone.
Right. It's not inherently like an ideal worth sticking to, just, at face value.
Yeah, exactly.
And to be fair, I definitely see Michael's point. Like, in a vacuum,
Yeah.
I think we would all kind of agree with him. It's just,
everything's much more complicated than that when you actually do it.
Yes, it's very complicated. I mean, I know Barbara has trimmed, 600-page novels by like 100 pages because she just thought, it rambled too long, and she wanted to make it the best, the book that would be the most likely to be read and appreciated in the U.S.
Yeah, and there is there's in David Bellos's book, Is There a Fish in Here? It talks about like higher and lower languages, or I forget if he uses a different term, upper and down or up and down languages, where like if you're translating into English is moving up into a language that's read by a wider group of people and is more respected. And so there's different translation techniques that are applied than if you're translating down and from English into, say, Hungarian, where adopting different Americanisms into the prose in the Hungarian translation will have a different effect. And for better or for worse, there's a lot of books that by making it into English will then make it elsewhere. There's the Latvian book that Kaya translated that we published, High Tide, that's being published in I don't remember, it's an African language. And it's only being translated into that language because they read it in English. There's no one that speaks whatever language it was in Africa that reads Latvian.
Well, yeah, that brings up another point or another issue that I was going to ask you about just the last time you were talking, is that this happens. People do translate, what do you call that? Like third party or
second
generation translation or something. I don't know if there's a proper term for it.
There is, and I can't think of it right now.
That should not be done. But I want to go on record as saying that's a really bad idea.
I don't think it is with certain languages like that, language pairings. It is with like French or German to English or French to German or Japanese to Chinese, where there's like large speakers, but like Zimbabwe or like Zulu to Latvian, and unless you're gonna find some way to fucking train someone that it's just never gonna happen. So why would there be a reason to like cut off people from the rest of the world just because no one has the ability to speak those two language pairs and as a translator? But generally speaking, I agree with you. Like all those Gombrowicz books were translated through French, I believe, initially.
That's true. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the first translations of them were from the French version of the Polish original into English. But then there's like Kundera, who didn't like the translations of his books from Czech to English. He liked them from Czech to French to English, which is also weird. But yeah, generally speaking, that's pretty problematic. But this is even beyond like the translation of it, just the ability to know what it is. Like if there isn't so there's a lot of publishers that will work off of say an Icelandic or Chinese will keep using our Arabic book. Once that book's translated into say German and the publishing house has a German reader, they can read that German version and evaluate that book, even if they don't use that as the translation source. They use the original text as the translation source. Without it being entered into that language and being able to be read, it would be pretty much have no chance of being able to make it into English at all. Because we don't have that many that many editors that are reading a lot of those languages.
No, that's where the reports come in. I mean, when Penguin Classics, I mean, I don't think anyone at the Penguin Classics reads in another language, and they just get readers' reports, and they have very trusted translators and readers, and they go off of that. And, they do their research on the book itself and, try to discern what they can about style and all of these things and whether or not it's a good fit. But, when it comes down to the actual text, they have to, at some point, trust someone else's opinion on it.
Yeah, there's some faith, there's some trust involved, definitely at every point. So you want to switch over to this thing about the Kobo data?
Yeah, I forgot when I sent this to you. That
a million years ago, it seems like, but it was probably like 2 weeks ago.
January 21st. Over
that's a month ago, yeah. Okay.
So, this is on Newsfeed, which is trying to make
Buzzfeed?
Buzzfeed, yes. What did I say?
Newsfeed,
Oh,
which is kind of awesome. I know.
It reminds me, just sort of out of the middle of nowhere, we're only now watching House of Cards.
Oh.
And the reporter whatever her name is, Kate Mara, the actress, works for a website called Slugline, which is the worst fucking name ever.
I've never watched that yet. I haven't watched it yet.
It's good, but that's another discussion.
Yeah.
There appears to be a fire across the street. Anyway, so on Buzzfeed News, which Buzzfeed is trying to make itself over from its, lists, nonstop lists, there's this report that, what does it say? Publishers know you didn't finish The Goldfinch. Here's what that means for the future of books. Let me just cut to the chase here and say it doesn't mean anything for the future of the book.
Yeah.
As
one thing BuzzFeed's good at is putting up those link bait titles.
Yeah. As a friend of mine, an agent who you may or may not know, Claudia Ballard, is quoted in here. What does it say? She says somewhere in here about, sales, basically. And, hold on. I'm still trying to find it. Here it is. She says, the truth of the matter is people have been picking up books and not finishing them for a long time. At the end of the day, a unit sold is a unit sold. And, this is, I think I mentioned this back when we had our Dennis Johnson book club, but that for a long time, Tree of Smoke was the book that everyone was buying and not finishing because it was so long and so Dennis Johnson. But, it won a big award, and I think it got people to buy it, and then they were like, oh, I don't like this at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Kobo, which for those who don't know, and I imagine most listeners don't know, is the independent bookstore version of the Kindle. It's sold in independent bookstores in America and Canada. And Britain.
It's big in Canada and elsewhere in the world.
It's huge in Japan.
Yeah, in Japan.
Huge in Japan.
Not so big in America.
Not so big in America. I don't think it's actually, functionally just as good as the Kindle. But to say that only Kobo is doing this is sort of unfair. But
no, everyone
they track
does it, yeah.
reader habits. They know how much of a book you read. They know how long it takes you to read each book. How often, how many times during the day you're reading. All of this sort of stuff. How many books you buy and never open. All of this sort of stuff. And so they know that less than half of Canadian and British Kobo readers made it through the end of Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch. Less than half.
That doesn't surprise me, to be honest.
The question is, what on earth are they doing with this information? I have a hard time as a publishing person extrapolating anything useful out of this.
There's such a movement for big data stuff like this, though, of like being able to track and see like where people where people stop, what that means about people. It's more interesting as like research and like making broad sweeping generalizations about the way that human beings enter and like act and do things than I think anything to do with publishing, to be honest. But more about like reading habits and the way that functions. But this article is guided, that you already gave away the punchline, but is guided towards like, well, if they have this information, they can be like, well, your last book, people stopped reading on page 272, so change 272 and what you did there. Otherwise, we'll never publish your new book. Which I don't think that sort of information can come out of this at all.
No, I mean, also 272 is an average. Let's be clear here. So
right. Unless literally like 95% of people stop on page 272, because you would know that information as well.
Wouldn't that be in this article? Like if some like horrible plot twist that no one approves of is on page 272.
It is right there. That's why I'm using 272. So it's used as an example. If everyone is stopping on page 272, well, maybe there's an editorial problem on page 272. I know that they've been tracking this information forever in terms of like, there's a guy that was on a panel with me and, or it was in a panel. It was like a series of speeches in the Netherlands about digital stuff. And he was one of the people that worked with Wiley to create when Wiley did all their ebooks. I forget what this guy's name is. And I forget what the name of the Wiley's deal was, but, part of what he did was they created some app that was like the Kindle on your phone app. And if you read the book within that app, then they would know exactly when you read it and tracked all that information for their own sources. And I remember him saying that like the Barack Obama book was read by a certain demographic mostly between the hours of like 12 and 2 p.m., like while people were on lunch hour. and they generally got to like 3/4 of the way through, whereas like the so the Nick Cave had a book come out around that same time, right? That book was read from like midnight till 1 a.m. and like people went like 33% into it and had a totally different demographic. But they were looking at like when people are reading those particular books and what they're doing. So it's not just Kobo, like everyone's tracking this information and like where people are within it. It's
Again, how is that useful?
I think for their company, I think it's to figure out which books fall into those patterns to market those books to that demographic. So like if there are lots of books that are read by at a similar point in time, a similar sort of way, they might have something in common that will allow you to market that book to that reader. That there's some reason that those are the types of books that, so people who are reading, I mean, the general assumption there is that kids who are reading the Nick Cave books are kids, reading them late at night, whatever, and that the Barack Obama readers were professionals who were reading on their lunch hours during this time. If there are other books that sort of fall in those demographics, then you can start to market your advertising within your app and within your reader to make the books more specific. It's all about that discoverability, like figuring out which book the person wants to buy or read next. And I think that they want to use that information to be able to sell ads that are more effective.
So basically from 11 to midnight, there'll be, or, I guess while they're reading as well, kids who liked, and why are we saying kids? I love the Nick Cave book. I
think because their demographic was there were people who were ages 16 to 21. If I remember right, that's what it was. So they're not kids, but
Fair enough. Anyway, so these people will be advertised to at a certain time of day and
with a book,
a certain type of book. But,
right. And like all of that stuff, like I mean, you're not going to make money off of selling books or ebooks. You're going to make money off of selling ads to sell ebooks, or ads for other products. So if the more you know about your demographic and where things are, the more you're going to know about who you can sell the ads to that will be willing to pay to reach that particular group of people. So I think like this whole thing is like off center because I don't think people editorial wise give a shit about this. I think people that are doing like the sales and marketing care about it in a weird sense of like what else can they get you to buy? Not even like not one of these publishers cares if you read one of their books. Like they don't expect these things to affect social change. They just want to sell units. Like they could give a shit.
Yeah.
Like I could buy 400 books on my Kindle, not read one goddamn page, and no one would complain about that or think any less of me. They'd probably love me as a customer.
Like if you were so inclined, you could buy 2,000 copies and get it on the bestseller list, right?
Yeah. Should be hilarious. There is like one of the things that's referenced in here too is that Macmillan's next big book deal, which it's still, I don't know how launched it is. I'm looking at it right now, and you can still enter in your email to get more information. But this is all directed towards marketers of like what happens when your book gets on the New York Times, what happens when you do certain social media things, and basically trying to analyze how to make a book more popular and to sell more. Not anything about the book itself. It's just that other currency of like where things go and what happens, what forces or what gets people to like make that purchase. So I think it's all based in that.
Yeah, I mean, so below the graphic here, after they mention of all things House of Cards, that was totally coincidental.
Really?
They mentioned, Netflix's algorithm that recommends things based on it, right?
Right.
And, which, to me, that seems like the very obvious bit of information when dealing with a customer that you have, a captive audience customer. You already know what they bought. Why do you need to know how long they got into it or, how long it took them to read them? I guess if they, bought Infinite Jest and hated it or didn't get very far into it, maybe you don't want to be recommending them other David Foster Wallace books. So you're just gonna lose their attention.
Exactly.
So I can understand how that matters, but in terms of books, I don't see where publishers would find any of this information valuable.
I think publishers, in the sense of their marketing departments, might find it interesting. I think researchers for like an academia might find it useful to like come up with like semi-obscure documents and papers and monographs on reading habits of 21st century Americans, but that's the limited value as well. But I don't think like a editorial department is interested in this at all. But like also there's the problem with like Netflix and all the algorithms that you use to like make recommendations is that they tend to be based on very subjective categories and subjective assessments. So like you might not have read half of Infinite Jest, but if you know that your evaluation of it is going to be on Twitter and on Facebook, you might give it 5 stars because you don't want to be the embarrassed next to your friends who liked it or whatever. So like people aren't always the most accurate at judging like or being honest about things. And so this data sort of cuts through that a little bit and allows like the back end marketers to say like, oh, we're not going to recommend Thomas Pynchon because that's also long and confusing to this person. They don't like this sort of thing, even though they might pretend they do. So I think it's basically just for marketing people and advertising people. That's what everything's for. Like, it's all just to make money off of ads.
It's really sad. I somehow scrolled all the way down to the comments on this BuzzFeed article, and someone says, but can BuzzFeed determine at which line I stopped reading this article? Bravo, sir.
Well done. Well done. Oh man, that Kobo like little screen too of like the reading stats is crazy.
Yeah. Also, it's a little blurry. Why not make that a little?
It's like they're not capable of figuring out how to make a high res JPEG. They're just like fuck
Considering
it.
it's Kobo.
It's Kobo.
US. I can believe
that's what they call clear in Canada.
Who doesn't finish Alice in Wonderland?
And how do they read 22% of it in 0.1 hours?
I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, it takes you an hour to read it. 61
pages turn in 0.1 hours? The fuck is going on there?
It's average.
This makes no sense. And what I really don't understand here, the shared items in my library, where events, notes, highlights, awards, books, characters, locations, book covers, is this things that you're sharing on your social media? So this is like the Read 2.0 people get like their jollies off of this kind of stuff of like, how are we going to make reading collaborative? How are we going to make like talking about books collaborative? Like all that kind of stuff this feeds into as well.
Yeah, well, we could go on and on about that as well.
I just have to leave one nice little jab in there.
It's just, yeah. I mean, don't feel like this is where the money should be being invested.
No,
that way. It's funny. Well, we were at a Winter Institute. I was talking to someone, and he was trying to convince me that online marketing and all this sort of stuff for our events, and that there should be like this database for events for books all over the city instead of like relying on Time Out New York and all these things. Like there should just be like a book one, so it should be everything book related, and it'll get people who are like visiting New York for the week or the weekend and interested in your events or whatever. And I was like, that's all fine and good. If you want to make that happen, go right ahead. To me, and I was luckily backed up by Steve Salardino, who's a bookseller at Skylight in Los Angeles. He's like, nothing gets customers to come for events at a bookstore like signs in the bookstore or me talking to customers about upcoming events. It is truly like one of the last places, like a bookstore, like. We sell so many more books from personal recommendations, from conversations we have in person than anything online could ever do. And it's the same for our events. Sure, we have a newsletter, but most of those people on our newsletter came into the store to sign up for it, And
yeah.
People like talking to each other in person. And this whole idea of like shared and whatever, sure, it's, I'm being old here and there's a generational gap and I certainly understand that. And, Goodreads thrives and whatever, but it's still not the same as talking to your friend about a book. And
and Goodreads doesn't have too many. Part of the reason it's sort of successful is the bells and whistles are pretty low level, and the website's ugly as shit. And like the things you can do are like rate a book and share it. I mean, I guess you can have forums, but those forums are like dial-up forums. Like the old 55.6 sort of logging into the internet to check on what your friend said about James Joyce.
Right. Like who's going to do that? Like, I don't know. To me, we should just accept that, what works well is the in-person interactions. And not just keep dumping money into these online sort of collaborative sort of sharing things with something that is, it's such a personal thing that I think people do find it weird to go on too long online or something like that. Reviews are one thing. I mean, there are online book clubs and whatever. Facebook is now doing it. Like,
holy shit! Did you see what Facebook chose?
It has something to do with vaccinations, right?
On Immunity, the Eula Best book that Grey Wolf has like a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Zuckerberg trying to be, politically or whatever engaged. I guess that's a good thing, but I don't know. I really hate the power some people have, I guess. That's my problem.
Yeah.
I hate that he made them, look, good for Grey Wolf. I'm sure they just got a huge influx of money from sales, but...
Oh, I'm absolutely sure. Not that wasn't selling really well to begin with, but...
the idea that, books only sell when a famous person recommends them is really disheartening.
Or when you find out that they're written by J.K. Rowling.
Or when they're... Exactly. Well, I mean, to be fair, people like her other books.
I know we've had this discussion before, but it's the same thing of like, it was a great book that no one cared about, and then they found out and they're like, oh shit, I'm on this. Yeah, that book is number 2,863 right now on Amazon. On Immunity is
2,000. Oh,
it's not super high, but
I wonder what it was yesterday when it was announced.
I think it was announced actually last week. I saw it and I just sort of ignored it for a little while. Number 5 is 50 Shades of Grey. That's falling in their list of top 100 books, though. So, what we never talked about, and that's number 7, is Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman.
Wait, what? How is that already a best-selling book?
Yeah, because it's available for pre-orders. This is just on Amazon. This is not anything else.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you say about that?
I just have issues with it. I just don't.
Definitely have issues with it.
I'm not going to read it. I don't care. I think it's gross.
New Directions have a lot of dead authors whose estates we take very seriously in terms of protecting, and I just can't imagine being a publisher and doing that to Harper Lee. I don't know.
Well, fuck her. You can make a lot of money, man.
I guess.
That's what it feels like. That's what it feels like. Even if it's, no matter what kind of things that they might say, or like people being like, oh, she's really happy. Like, none of it feels right. And it wouldn't have killed anyone to wait.
Even then, I mean, Nabokov's son deciding to go through with publishing
the original of Laura. Yeah.
Look, I love Nabokov and I read it, but I don't know that it should have been published.
Yeah, I didn't read it for that reason. I skipped it.
Well, you're more you get the moral upper hand.
Not necessarily. More than I did limited amounts of time, and there's better books I felt like, but whatever. I don't know. So you have to rant this week, right?
Yeah, I've been struggling something to rant about, partly because man, everything is fucked up, and it's endless winter and freezing and miserable, and I don't know, the Oscars are the biggest fucking waste of time, and people's false sort of being enraged about who wins what is annoying as fuck. But I'm just going to rant about what everyone else is ranting about, at least in New York City, and was on a Daily Show and whatever. Fucking Rudy Giuliani. I wish he would just go away and shut the hell up. And I wish, on top of that the media outlets that decided they wanted to give him space to sort of entrench himself further into his argument, while at the same time apologizing for saying that Obama wasn't patriotic. Like, I wish he would go away. And he's done... old politicians in this country just... sometimes they need to know, like, you know what? No one cares what you think anymore, and just walk away. Like, he got torn apart in the New York Post by an editorial.
That's rough.
The New York Post.
That is very rough.
in theory, love people like him.
Yeah.
And they were just like, you know what? No, no, we can't do it. And they tore him apart, and justifiably so. Anyway, I'm really sick of Rudy Giuliani, and I hope this is like his last hurrah, and that he just disappears and retires and, stays out of the public eye.
I agree with you. I was just thinking of some way that I wish there was like a limit on politicians. Like they could only be in the game for so long, and then they were just forced out.
One in, one out.
Yeah, just like, God damn it! Like they're all awful, and they just get recycled like shitty NFL coaches. They just show up in other places doing other annoying things and sucking.
Yeah, it's not like we have a lack of people who could take Rudy Giuliani's role.
But once you're entrenched, and once you've got that money flowing into you, and the people that you've rubbed their backs and they're rubbing yours, you are unstoppable.
Yeah.
Like you have to fuck up something hard to get kicked out of politics.
Yeah. Well, you'd think doing this would do it, but no.
It won't.
No.
It won't. I mean, Britney Spears made a comeback. Like everyone like just loves to bring these people back. Speaking of NFL, though, this is my rave. My rave is for the Cleveland Browns because they have become my favorite, just weird franchise ever. Because today, just a few minutes before I called you, I found that they have announced their new logos, which, if anyone knows football, the Cleveland Browns helmet is orange, and that is it, right? It is now a slightly different shade of orange.
Wait, you have to read the description of why they changed it.
Where is it? Oh, God, where is well, this doesn't have the description of why.
Oh, it's in there. Hold on, I'll find it.
I just love it.
It says, hold on. It's really, it has something to do with like the city's spirit, blah, blah, blah. Hold on. All right. It says, quote, "The orange is brighter and richer and matches the passion of our fans in the city." Wait,
I love these people.
This is under the category of colors. Underneath that, it says, "The brown is unchanged."
That's the part the brown is unchanged.
That's right.
I love it. They did vaguely changed the color of orange, and this is a whole new logo for the Cleveland Browns. The same Cleveland Browns who had no idea that Johnny Football was an addict and might have some problems.
Hey, if he's good at football, who cares?
Yeah. But he's really not, is he?
He
hard to say,
barely had any chance to play.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, there's more on the helmet. So our updated helmet logo, which, by the way, there is no logo.
Yeah.
Updated helmet logo is reflective of today's modern Cleveland. The design honors the past while evolving into the future. The iconic brown and white stripes stand tall over the orange helmet. A new orange color that matches the passion of the dog pound. Dog, by the way, is spelled D-A-W-G.
Of course.
Of course. The new brown face mask, which I guess they had white ones before. Hey.
I guess. No one watches the Browns.
No one pays attention to that. New brown face mask represents the strength and toughness of Cleveland.
You may have seen this, but do you know how many years it took them to come up with this change?
No.
2. They spent 2 years. 2 years revising the logo to this slightly different shade of orange and a brown whatever face mask.
Stripe?
That's it. I fucking love them. They just seem worthless.
Well, they also didn't they just like suspend Josh Gordon for a year? It's not a franchise that really understands what they're doing. Kind of all over the place.
They're owned by that guy that got arrested for all the embezzlement and problems with his truck stops, right?
I honestly have no idea.
I'm pretty sure, whatever, if I'm lying and slandering this guy who gives a shit, it's the Cleveland Browns. I'm pretty sure they're owned by the guy that was like the scumbag that owned all the truck stops who fucked everyone over and stole all their money.
All right. I just remembered something that I wanted to mention earlier before we sign off here about editing translations. And this is not even a translation. But when I was in college, I read Epcot Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night.
Yeah.
When I was in Peace Corps in traveling in South Africa. I can't remember which city. I'm going to guess Cape Town. I came across a copy in a used bookstore and bought it because I wanted to reread it because, one, I wanted something to read, and two, it had been a couple of years and whatever. I wanted to read it outside of the classroom experience. I could be totally wrong. I have not gone through the trouble of finding these various editions from whatever South African publisher and American publisher. I felt like large sections of the story, which, it's told over years and sort of not necessarily in order anyway, were reordered.
They are. There's 2 versions of this book.
See?
And it's not just in South Africa, it is in America as well. He had it in one way and then cut it apart and reordered it. I don't know what
the publisher did that.
He did that. And I don't remember which if they both were published simultaneously. 2 versions of this novel are in print. The first version, published in 1934, uses flashbacks. The second, revised version, prepared by Fitzgerald's friend and noted critic Malcolm Cowley, so it wasn't him, on the basis of notes for a revision left by Fitzgerald, is ordered chronologically and was first published posthumously in 1948. So he left the notes. I know that he cut it apart and tried to reorder it, but I think he died. So so Malcolm Cowley took it over. But yes, there are 2 versions of that book. Well, I like the first one. I don't like the second one at all. I'm a big fan of the first one, though.
I mean, they were both enjoyable. It's a really well-written book. But the point is, the book is always a work in progress, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Definitely. I think that's it.
All right.
Always a work in progress might be the title of this one.
Well, this podcast is always a work in progress. Although I will say I listened to the last one when I thought it was going to be a melee of voices. Pretty good podcast.
I know, it worked out really well.
Yeah.
I was surprised too, but I think it was because no one stepped on each other's voices.
Which is easier to do when you can all look at each other.
Exactly. Yeah. The hard ones are when I have 2 of you on the line and you can't see each other. And you wouldn't be able to anyways, but then no one knows. And so there can either be those dead moments that we have to cut out where no one's replying or both people are replying at once.
Right.
Yeah, that worked fine. That was great.
All right, that's it. Hey, should we announce that we're maybe on our next podcast we should do the book club?
Yeah. I read 20 pages of that last night while I was feverish and delusional. And the thing that I remember most clearly at this moment is that Charlie Hebdo's mentioned on page 3.
This is true.
I thought that was pretty funny. I almost texted you at 3:30 in the morning. A crazy moment of I'm so sick, but I'm trying to read this goddamn book.
Anyway, so we probably won't record for another 2 weeks. Who knows when this will go up? But it's not a long book, so whenever you're hearing this, go out and get a copy of Jean-Patrick Manchet's, what is it? Mad in the Bad?
Mad in the Bad.
Published by New York Review of Books. It's 150 pages. It's really good, and we'll be talking about it on the next podcast. So you have 10 days, maybe 2 weeks from when you hear this to go and read it so you can listen to our podcast.
I think there's also someone who gets their heart cut open on the first page, so that's enticing.
Yeah, to get you give a sense of I told you there's a lot of carnage.
Yeah. I also want to talk on our next podcast for a minute about the National Book Critics Circle finalists, because I've been reading a bunch of them just because I'm going to be there. I'm just sort of curious. I want to make some predictions.
All right, fair enough. That'll do it.
Okay, I'll talk to you later, man.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Every time I look for you, maybe